Alright, we had a request for a problem here dealing with the direct and indirect, or direct write-off and allowance method when it comes to accounts receivable. And what we've got here is during August 2018, ABC recorded the following. They had sales of $133,300, $122,000 on account, $11,300 for cash, collections on account of $106,400, write-offs of $990, and recovery of receivables previously written off of $800. So we've got two things to do here. One is to journalize these transactions using the direct write-off method, and the other is to journalize the transactions using the allowance method. Remember, in direct write-off method, we're just usually expensing these write-offs directly to our bad debt expense account. So let's look at the number one here where we're journalizing. And of course, the first thing we had was sales of $133,300, $122,000 on account. We ought to know that means we debit accounts receivable for $122,000. $11,300 in cash means we debit cash for $11,300, and then we're going to end up crediting sales revenue for the total $133,300. The second part, or the second thing here, says collections on account were $106,400. Basically, that means we collected cash, or we were paid for our accounts receivable over this year or period, 1064, and we credit accounts receivable here since we received these collections were on account. Now, the next thing we have is the write-off of uncollectible receivables. And when we're using direct write-off, all we have to do here is debit bad debt expense. Debit bad debt expense for the amount, which is $990, and credit the accounts receivable for the same amount, the $990. And it says in the last one we have recovery of receivables previously written off, which means essentially this transaction we have to reverse, because if we've recovered those, and we don't have to write off the bad debt, but the thing is we can only reverse it in the amount that we received. So in this case it was $800. So the first, we have two transactions here we have to journalize. We have to debit our accounts receivable for the $800 and then credit the bad debt expense for the $800. Okay, that means we've reinstated the accounts receivable. And the last part here is since we collected the money, we received cash. So we have $800 in cash, and then we're going to credit the accounts receivable for $800. Now that is the direct write-off method. Now next to that, we'll try and do
I can learn to understand you much better if I can get familiar with the way you talk.
We'll try and do the allowance method here, right next to it. So in the allowance method, we're using the same values, the same information. We're going to, again, in the first transaction, won't change. We'll be debiting accounts receivable for our 122, debiting cash for the 11,300, and then crediting sales revenue for the total, the 133,300. And next we received cash on account. This won't be any different. We'll have cash for $106,400, and again accounts receivable for 1064. And then now when we write off, when we get to the point where we're writing off here, what we've got to do is now, instead of just debiting bad debt expense here for the write-offs, we've got to give an allowance for this. And in this case, what we're going to do is debit our allowance for bad debt or for doubtful accounts. And we will debit this for the amount, the $9.90. And then we have to credit accounts receivable for the $9.90. So it's very similar to what we do in the direct write-off, except instead of just directly writing it off to bad debt expense, we write it to the allowance for bad debt. Now, when we come to the point where we're going to receive again, receive these funds that we thought were uncollectible, we do basically the same thing. We will have a debit to accounts receivable for $800, but here we have to credit our allowance for bad debt, and then the cash we received stays the same. So in journalizing these, there's not much of a difference with what we do. Basically, if we went further with this, and we looked at it in a T account format, which I may do in another video at some point, we would see how differences can compound between these two methods. But the biggest difference we see here is bad debt expense. We're directly writing it off and expensing it. The allowance for bad debts may contain a running amount in it that carries over from period to period until we get to a point where essentially we are expensing that. So I hope this helps a little bit. I will see you in the next video.